Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Dribble Drive podcast. Your hosts, Austin Render, Dalton Shetler here with you on a Tuesday, February 11th, a live show on the Back Home Network YouTube channel. Come join us live if you haven't throughout the season for our live shows. We want to get people involved in the comments, so leave your questions. We'll try and get to them here in the show. We are also available Apple and Spotify. Podcast, download, give us a rating. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. All that stuff helps us as we continue to build up the product. And if you enjoy listening to us, tell a friend. We're heading into the crunch time here, Dalton. Football is officially over, which means basketball gets the scene here for the next month and a half to 2 months. It is all us for the rest of the season. Eyes are on basketball. It's a great time to be basketball fans. How are you, man?
I'm doing pretty good. It kind of disheveled going through the grind that you talk about, but I got to tell you, I feel a bit sorry for the casual fan who just jumps into basketball after football, because now, especially with how late the football season pushes with the college football playoff, you've missed the front half of what all has happened. And I guess maybe that's why you tune in here, so we can try to catch you up to speed with what has happened, because we've kind of went in a couple of circles throughout
Yeah.
this season.
We would need a whole episode separate of our normal episode to catch you up. But go back and listen. All the episodes are available on the Back Home Network YouTube channel and in podcast form. And if you did not listen to our episode last week with Charlie Cream, ESPN's bracketologist, definitely go listen to that. I think some of the things he said reigned true here this past week. And one of those, Dalton, was the Big Ten is almost rooting, if you're a conference trying to get the most teams in, there's certain scenarios you're rooting for. You think about teams that are maybe trending downward, like Minnesota, then they beat Indiana. It doesn't knock Indiana out, but it gives Minnesota a quad 2 win, which they were lacking. And I thought last night maybe had Nebraska won. That would have been a good thing for the conference, but Iowa took care of them. The way that Michigan has now bounced back and they are rolling again. So there's a lot of good things going on for the conference. Let's open up, as we do here, with our check-in on the top 25. Same 5 teams continue to be ranked. We're looking at just slight movements for USC. I thought fair. We could debate whether or not Ohio State should have fallen more, but the AP poll did not feel as though they needed to punish Ohio State greatly for the 0-2 trip to LA. Maryland drops 1 despite an undefeated week. I think that had more to do with the people around them getting some big wins as opposed to punishing Maryland, because they went out and got a hard-to-do West Coast sweep up in the Pacific Northwest. And then Michigan State goes 0-1 on the week, a loss to Michigan, so they drop 2 spots. I thought there was a chance Michigan would creep up a little bit further, but they were not even really knocking on the door. Illinois was much closer to getting in. And again, they've won 6 in a row, so probably deserve it as well. Any takeaways from this, Dalton?
I think you nailed it with Ohio State. And I think if you watched their game against UCLA, you came away at first and said, well, Ohio State's given themselves a shot against the giant UCLA. I mean, they forced so many Bruin turnovers. They had a chance, and they just couldn't buy a bucket. They couldn't capitalize on any of the opportunities. UCLA pulls away, but you thought that was an okay showing from Ohio State. USC was a bit of a disappointment if you're an Ohio State fan, and just in terms of the Buckeyes didn't really ever feel in that one. Like that's the one where maybe you thought Ohio State would drop a couple more. I think more from the USC loss than the UCLA loss. But I mean, overall, a lot of teams are going to go 0-2 on the LA swing from the Big Ten. Maryland, yeah, and I mean, you talk about the conference rooting for teams to get signature wins. Washington nearly had that, at least in the beginning portion of their game against Maryland.
Too in the fourth quarter as well. Yeah.
Yeah. But the Terps hanging on, moving 1. I mean, an AP top 25, and as you said, as much chaos is happening in college basketball, not too big of a deal. Michigan State dropping 2. I was curious how much Michigan State was going to be punished from the loss to Michigan on Sunday. I don't know that Michigan State has jumped up too many times where I thought maybe they should. And here they didn't fall too far when I thought maybe they would. So that they felt kind of like water finding level a little bit in terms of the poll. But I mean, you talk about conference rooting for certain teams with a bubble talk. Illinois, Michigan's entering that stratosphere where maybe we end up with 7 teams ranked in the top 25, depending how results shake out.
Yeah. And Maryland, a team that I think did themselves a lot of good as they try to play themselves back into the hosting conversation. Michigan State maybe on the opposite spectrum of that, but Maryland certainly with 2 big road wins get themselves right back into that conversation. I want to put the standings up just because I'm going to use it as a talking point. I came up with an analogy for this Big Ten season, Dalton.
Oh
Uh,
boy.
it's like the Indy 500, or really any IndyCar race or NASCAR race, where when you see somebody at the top of the leaderboard who was like completely like, wait, how did they get up there? How are they in third? How are they in second? How's that guy leading? And then you realize, oh, it's because they haven't pitted yet. And the
Yeah.
real facto leader of the race is in like 7th place. And that's how I look at teams that haven't gone through the LA swing yet. I
Yeah.
look at the Illinois and the Michigan State as they kind of hang out in that top third of the Big Ten standings. And I think, well, this is great. Illinois has won 6 in a row. I know Michigan State's trending in the wrong direction, but still up there a half game out of 4th place. I think, okay, that's great, but they haven't played LA yet. And they both go out there. Michigan State coming up this week. I believe you guys leave.
At the weekend. So Sunday is the first game at UCLA.
And then Illinois is the last team to go out to LA for their Los Angeles swing. So, and I don't want to sit here and say that's 2 losses for both teams. And anything can happen in the game of basketball, but let's just say it is. And all of a sudden now you make them Michigan State 8-6, Illinois 9-6, and those standings look a lot different.
Yep.
Whereas teams like Michigan and Maryland and Indiana and Oregon have already played, and Nebraska, they've all already played both of those teams. So just something to keep in mind as you look at these standings and you start to think, okay, Illinois is in the driver's seat for the 4 seed. Maybe not, because they still have to play on the road at both UCLA and USC. For my money, just looking at the standings, Maryland is in the driver's seat. As we thought maybe 3 weeks ago before everything kind of started to unravel for Maryland, they're right back in what I would say the quote unquote driver's seat. But it's a very uncomfortable driver's seat where you can't get like the lumbar support and the angles wrong, because it could eject at any time with this Big Ten conference that we're looking at. But I just thought that was interesting. I was sitting there looking at the standings yesterday, and I'm like, you have to know where everybody is in the race. You have to know when they've pitted, where are they at? And for Illinois and Michigan State, they've got tough tasks coming up here. Even Iowa still has 1 left against UCLA, so that's something to keep an eye on as well. But Ohio State's been through it. They're done. Not to say these teams that don't play the LA schools won't lose again. They certainly will, more than likely. But it just seems like something that we should keep our eyes on.
Well, I love that analogy. I also love the check engine light flashing on Maryland's dash as they continue along. But I'm with you, and I think it is something to note. And like Michigan State, you mentioned they got the LA swing. They're also at Ohio State, so there are tough games aplenty for the Spartans and for numerous teams. But the other thing I'd mention here too, Austin, is if Washington jumps back into the right side of the bubble. I mean, we're looking and talking about 13 teams from the Big Ten Conference. Even if it's not the premier elite, there just aren't easy games in this league. I mean, more than likely, you're playing an NCAA tournament game just about every time you lace it up in this conference. That's a ridiculous thing to utter. And so even if it's not the LAs, like, everybody's going to have to keep their wits about it, because this is going to be a grind for the final 5 to 6 games, and it's going to be fun to watch.
Yeah, I think the SEC has more hosting schools, more top tier talent. But the Big Ten is a little bit deeper in the back end and how many teams could potentially make it to the NCAA tournament. Let's start with the LA swing for the Ohio State Buckeyes. I put this as my game of the week just because of the circumstances around it. But to be honest with you, Dalton, it was not a great basketball game. Neither team shot the ball very well. Ohio State shot 29% in both games. Now, if you tell me you're going to LA for 2 games and you're going to shoot 29% in both, you're walking out 0-2. It doesn't matter what else you do. And like you mentioned in this game, they forced a ton of turnovers. They forced 23 UCLA turnovers, scored 17 points off of them. But it just and this is my greater point is this. UCLA is so good offensively. We know what they can do with Lauren Betts and the shooters, but defensively, man, they are locked down, and they took everything away from Ohio State. I was so impressed by the way they made Ohio State's life difficult. And what they did, Dalton, I don't know if you noticed this, they really dared Ohio State to shoot over them.
Yep.
They're going to pack the paint. They're going to take the right hand away from Cody McMahon, make her go left, take the driving angles away from the Taylor Theories and the Jelani Cambridges of the world. I think Asia Petty went scoreless in this game, and they just said, shoot over us, and Ohio State was unable to do so.
Yeah, and I think you nailed it on the head where we talk so much about Lauren Betts and we talk about the array of shooters on their perimeter and just what a well-oiled machine it was or is. And in this game, it just wasn't there. I mean, offensively, a lot of times they didn't get shots up because of those turnovers we talk about. They won this game with defense. And I think if you've been watching UCLA throughout this year, you could almost say UCLA's defense has been more impressive than the offense, but I don't think the casual spectator has quite understood that. But this was the exhibit A. This was the shining example to take a look at. UCLA holds Ohio State to 52 points in this game. And you're right. I mean, they did it just by forcing the Buckeyes to take shots. And this is what we talked about earlier, Austin, is Ohio State created opportunities. You force that many turnovers, you create that many more looks. You just didn't take advantage of it.
Yep. Yeah, UCLA finishes out rebounding Ohio State 49-33. That was actually, if we put the two games together, and we'll talk about it in a second, the rebounding margin, did you see the rebounding margin that USC Ohio State game? 62-30. You don't see that in conference games very often. That is
that's Ohio State's going to be a 2 or 3 seed.
Yeah,
somewhere in there.
It's not like they were playing the Southern California City College. Like they were playing Ohio State, and they out rebounded them 62-30. So Ohio State gets out rebounded by 16 and then by 32 on this road trip. Lauren Betts had a double-double. She was really good, but they didn't shoot the three that well. This is a tie game early in the fourth quarter. And for UCLA to have not played its best, I would say also not played their best later this week against Oregon.
Yep.
And to win the games both by double figures, both down the stretch of the game, not that close, and not like when's the last time UCLA in the final 4 or 5 minutes of a game, you said, I got to turn this on because UCLA might be in trouble? Right. I don't think it's happened this year.
Right.
And my memory would have to be jogged on the Louisville game in the opener. But even then, I just remember them just always staying ahead of Louisville. And it's just crazy. They blew out South Carolina. They pull away from Ohio State. They've just had so many of these very impressive performances where they leave no doubt behind. Now, they still have to play USC twice. They still have to go to Iowa. But, man, they're passing all the tests right now.
Well, and I think the best way to explain it, Austin, is it goes to show the gulf that we've been talking about for a while that UCLA has on everybody in terms of talent and execution. And for them to continue to win games handedly when they're not playing well goes to show, again, just how good they are. That being said, it shows that there are possibilities. Maybe if you could force the turnovers, you create those extra possessions. But again, you can't come walking away shooting 29%. You have got to show up with your A game, and you've got to hope for one of those off UCLA days, which has shown it can happen. But it takes the exact right recipe for a win against UCLA. Yes. It's just they have that much of a talent disparity.
Yeah, they win by 10 at Oregon on Sunday. It wasn't like an impressive performance. They only had one player in double figures, London Jones with 21. That's big to get that from London Jones.
Mm-hmm.
The bigger conversation for UCLA now, Dalton, is, okay, there's a clear gulf in the Big Ten that we'll see this week if USC can jump into that or not. Yep. But nationally, South Carolina just got beat, but That was at Texas. South Carolina's looked very good here lately. Texas has looked good. Notre Dame hasn't been all that challenged to the ACC. They did lose to North Carolina, I believe. But where does UCLA stack up in all of that? First off, if Corey Close isn't your national coach of the year, I don't know who is. She's done an absolutely tremendous job with this program. Well, Lauren Betts has got to be in the conversation for National Player of the Year. I think, honestly, with Juju's struggles here recently, there's a real chance that she's Big Ten Player of the Year. She's been so.
I didn't think that was possible. I thought Juju was going to walk away with that before the season started.
But Juju has struggled here over the last couple of games for USC. So I think the door is open for Lauren Betts to sneak in there and get that. But just something like we could talk about them in the Big Ten, but UCLA is at the point now where they're not thinking about where they stack up in the Big Ten. UCLA fans are probably thinking about where do we stack up in winning a national title? And they deserve to have that conversation sitting at 23-0, the most consecutive wins in school history. I mean, you and I focus on the Big Ten. I don't get to watch as much with our busy schedules. I just try to watch as much Big Ten as I can. So I can't totally say where they stack up with South Carolina and Texas and Notre Dame, but they definitely are one of probably the 2 or 3 teams that everyone would pick to win a national title if the bracket was laid out today.
Oh, I think for sure that, and I think where the conversation gets even more interesting is I think you can have a real conversation of, is UCLA the favorite right now?
Yeah,
Not just the one of 2 or 3 to have that be an expectation or a goal, but are they the favorite? And I think a lot of people might tell you yes, just on the way they've been executing. Now you're right; they're coming off a week where they haven't played maybe their best ball. But when you take a look and stack them across some of those best in the country, it's hard not to take that UCLA resume and slide it a bit ahead of everybody else and say that they are the favorite. And I still think too, and we're going to see what USC can do against UCLA, right, in these 2 games, and that'll help maybe frame some of our national conversation about the Trojans. But UCLA still has a ceiling that is high enough to, or not UCLA, excuse me, USC still has a ceiling that is high enough to push for an expectation like that. And I think, Austin, a lot of times when people talk Big Ten basketball, and really this has been men's and women's too, when you look at the Big Ten Conference, a lot of it is great. You got 10 teams into the dance and 1 is in the second weekend. Like that's often been some of the narrative, especially the last 5 years with the men until Purdue was able to make it to the national championship game. But that's been an often frequent conversation there. And with the women, like when you talk about 13 teams getting in, that is worth something if that happens, even if it's just 12. It is absolutely worth something. It is still wildly impressive, but there will be a question of how many teams do move on.
Yeah.
And I think this year, UCLA, USC can expect to be in a second weekend. Ohio State could expect to be in a second weekend. Maryland, I think there's even maybe a couple other programs. Like that, we're talking about more than just 1 or 2 punching their way and advancing in this tournament this year.
And there's a lot of different styles in the Big Ten, too. You've got teams that want to get out and run. You got teams that will rely on their defense. You got teams like UCLA, who I think are capable of doing both. USC's defense has been much improved this season. So we'll see. But, I mean, we're all circling Thursday night. 10 p.m. Eastern time, Dalton.
Get your coffee.
Oh, my goodness. Come on, people.
I've never felt more old
over here.
Never felt more old than these late tip times and just trying to pry my eyelids open for these games.
Oh man, yeah. We're doing a radiothon this week at the radio station, so it's like, oh gosh, I need some sleep. These are long days at work, and now I'm going to be up till midnight watching some women's basketball, but absolutely worth it. Let's wrap up the point on Ohio State. They lost to USC after that, 29% again from the floor. So they come away 0-2. I would say competitive in 1.
Yep.
Not quite that competitive in the second. Where do we stand on Ohio State? Are they in a tier? It's not really a tier if you're one team, but like, are they in their own tier in the Big Ten right now? Like, they can't quite get up to the LA schools, but I think they're better than the folks right behind them.
Yeah.
It's also tough because they had to go on the road. Like, what happens if they match up in Indianapolis with one of these teams? It's a neutral site, maybe something different. But from what you've seen, where does Ohio State fit into this jigsaw puzzle of the Big Ten?
Well, I think it is kind of that tier in the third. And I have maybe a different perspective of Ohio State where I think if we're playing this out on paper, Ohio State is clearly after the LAs and maybe before everybody else in the Big Ten. But I've continued to say to you, Austin, I don't know exactly how you feel about the Buckeyes, but I think they're wildly talented. I still don't think they've reached their potential. And in a lot of games this year, I still don't think they're executing at the level they can, which on one end, if you want to play glass half full, goes to show what may be in store for them if they can put it together. But on the other hand, I'm still just sitting there and I'm like, I know you're good, but you lost to Penn State at Penn State. You've played down to maybe the level of competition at times, and then the USC game, you don't show up. I still I don't know that I can depend on a nightly basis that Ohio State shows up and plays like Ohio State can. I don't know if that's fair, but that's just the gut feeling I have from them.
Well, that's the big reason to me why UCLA is heads and toes better than everybody else in the league because they have been the most consistent. They've shown up day in and day out, whether it's a
Yep.
good offensive night or they rely on their defense, they can do both. Just pulling up the standings again, something to watch for here. Ohio State now sits at 9-3.
Hmm.
Look at that win column. They are now tied with Illinois, who they beat, and Maryland, who they beat but will play again. Michigan State is now just a game back. Spartans, as we mentioned, haven't pitted yet to LA, but they will play Ohio State. So an
Yep.
opportunity for the Spartans to get tiebreaker on Ohio State there. They have already beaten Michigan. They will play Indiana. So I'm not trying to sit here and put the alarm bells on that Ohio State's going to
Right.
fall to 6 or 7 in the conference, but it does. It's what we talked about in last week's show. It does open up the possibility that seeds 3 and 4 are a little bit more open, certainly 4, but even seed number 3, a little bit more open than we had thought a couple weeks ago.
I agree. Well, and to the point of Ohio State, even in the wins, it feels like the game. Recent example in my mind was coming back from a game and on the bus and checking out where they were playing Washington, and Washington was struggling at the time, and they were within 2 scores late in
Yep.
that game. It doesn't feel like I would feel more comfortable, Austin, in believing in the Buckeyes to its fullest potential and extent if they start putting away some of these teams. And we haven't really seen them put away some of these teams, and we know they're capable of. Like we talk about the talent disparities, Ohio State has a pretty big talent disparity between
Yeah.
Cambridge, man. Like that's an all-star squad. They have Chance Gray. I mean, you can go up and down what the Buckeye roster has. But yeah, it's kind of hard for me to figure out because I don't think they're playing to their full potential yet. That we still got another few weeks before the regular season ends. They could get it all to gel and click, and what that looks like would be pretty scary and something certainly to be reckoned with.
Absolutely, and just looking at their final schedule here, sharing that on the screen, they have 4 home games left, so that's big.
Yep.
The 2 road games are not easy by any means. They've got to go to Indiana, they've got to go to Maryland, but that's a schedule that I would say lays out fine for Ohio State to make their way still in that top 4 and still a hosting school. I do think that had they come out of LA differently, maybe even won just 1 game, they could
Yep.
have started to talk themselves into a 2 seed. They win both games, maybe they're a 1 seed. But now I think you're looking at 3 seed probably for Ohio State at this stage. There's too much to talk about in the Big Ten to just focus on the
Yes.
top 3 because boy, does it get interesting in the middle of this conference. I get co-team of the weeks this week. So let's start with Iowa. It's 2 teams that went 2-0 on the road this week and both deserve it, Iowa and Michigan. So
Mhm.
the Hawkeyes start their week by going to Minnesota and winning 68-60 in a game where I was very intrigued. Minnesota's coming off the losses on the LA swing. Iowa's coming off the USC win. How would they handle that success? And they were great. Hannah Stalky was good. Lucy Olson, Sydney Folter with a double-double. They really jumped out on Minnesota early. Gophers were not ready early in this game. Now they battled back, but Iowa ultimately hit shots down the stretch. And Mixing that with this Nebraska result last night, 81-66, here's my thoughts on Iowa.
Mhm.
And you're going to see it reflected a little bit in my power rankings.
Mhm.
This team is getting really good. And you can see the coaching that Jan Jansen is implementing in this team, the improvement. Excuse me, I'm going to cough here. Gotta love February.
All right.
But they just are playing their best basketball right now. They have a lot of weapons. It just feels like Lucy Olson's figuring it out. I don't know about you, Dalton, but I've watched this team lately, and I'm like, that's a really good basketball team.
No, I agree, and I think you nailed it too, where they're playing some of their best basketball right now, and Lucy Olson goes off for 30 some again in this last game against Nebraska. And one of the interesting things to me is checking out the box scores and Lucy starting to get it figured out from distance a bit too. I
Yep.
mean, because
Yep.
she really had been struggling from the perimeter. I mean, she is, I think we've talked about it before. I've likened her to a 1990s NBA player where it's consistently in the mid range and just the bag
Yep.
is deep and she can get a pull up jumper any which way you want it. Like she's got that kind of game. But for it to expand to be a bit more efficient on the outside, I think opens some things up. I think those underclassmen that we've talked about, especially Aaliyah Guyton, I think that's seeing them propel and develop already here in their freshman season. I think they've been able to open some things up. You mentioned it last week that they've flipped a little bit of the way they played. They tried to go back to old school Iowa women's basketball style where you threw like a Sonano in the middle or you threw
Yep.
a Gustafson in the middle and you kind of played around it. And they've taken Addison O'Grady out of that starting lineup and it's helped kind of the flow of Iowa's offense. I'm with you. I think they're playing some of their best basketball. It's certainly the best basketball they played this year. I think they are reaching around their ceiling, which is pretty dang good. And you're seeing them rip off some Big Ten wins.
Yeah, this team, I've just been really impressed watching Lucy Olson recently because she looks comfortable. She looks confident. And that's scary because we know what she did at Villanova.
Right.
And man, can she fill it up? 32 points, 6 rebounds, 7 assists, knocked down 4 3-pointers in the win at Nebraska in a game that Iowa never trailed in. And I'm just telling you, this team was on the bubble a week and a half ago.
Yep.
They beat USC. They've won 5 games in a row now. They're over 500 in conference play. And they just feel like a team that if they get the right draw, could be a Sweet 16 team because
Agreed.
everything looks like it's coming together. And that's what you want from a team is to be playing your best basketball as we head into the home stretch here.
Yep.
And I think it was totally fair to give Jan Jansen some time to figure this thing out. I mean, she's in her first year, but she wasn't just in her first year. She's having to replace a legendary head coach in Lisa Bluter and the greatest player maybe the game has ever seen in Caitlin Clark. So there were going to be some growing pains. And I think for Lucy Olson, mentally, I'm replacing the best player that's not only ever played at Iowa, but maybe in the game. And that's who I am filling the shoes of. Now, I'm sure Jan Jansen and her staff have told Lucy repeatedly, we're not asking you to do what Caitlin did.
Right.
But mentally, that's in your head. Like they went out and got me because they needed a replacement for Caitlin Clark.
Well, and look, relatively, I'm not saying Lucy Olson is Mac Jones, but Mac Jones gets handed the keys to the Patriots dynasty after Tom Brady left, and you're kind of like, well, you know what I mean? It's
Yep.
it's certainly a hard thing to do. Now, I think Lucy Olson in Big Ten women's basketball is a lot better than Mac Jones is in the
Let's hope
NFL.
so. Let's
But
hope.
you get what I'm trying to say, like
Yes.
just the idea of following a goat. It's kind of daunting, and it just kind of it's a high bar that got handed over to Lucy. And recently, to your point, she feels like she's settling in and it's all clicking together for her.
Well, they will be on the road at Ohio State this coming Monday. Very interesting game there. I expect them to handle Rutgers at home Thursday, which will put them at 8-6 and winners of 6 in a row.
Mhm.
Can you take it on the road against the top 10 team? That will be fascinating. And this is an Iowa team that at times, now more so earlier in the season than now, but at times they've struggled with turnovers.
Yep.
And so can Ohio State speed them up and create turnovers? Was talking about presses this week and like the difference between some presses you'll see. Like Rutgers was pressing Indiana, and I was saying that they were doing it more so to make Indiana only have 20 seconds to work with once they
Hmm.
crossed half court. It wasn't a press that was trying to steal the ball. It
Yep.
was more so a press to slow you down.
Hmm.
Ohio State and Michigan State, in the same vein, are trying
Yep.
to press you to speed you up, which is funny that you can press somebody to slow them down and also speed them up. But Ohio State, Michigan State, those types of presses are attempting to get you to make decisions that you wouldn't normally make because your
Spot on.
brain is moving a million times a second.
Yep.
And meanwhile, some presses are just there to slow you down and make you churn clock. And then you get into your set with 15 on the timer instead of 25. And that makes a big difference.
And by the way, maybe for some non-basketball junkies, if they're listening to this, that's often called token pressure. Token pressure is often the kind of pressure that is more conservative, help escort you down the floor, eat up that shot clock.
Yeah. And you'll see 2-2-1s, you'll see 1-2-2s. Usually the 2-2-1s are the more aggressive ones. The 1-2-2s are usually just trying to kind of slow you down. But
Yeah.
it's just something to watch as you watch teams press. Not everyone's trying to create the 25 turnovers and the easy buckets. Sometimes it's just trying to make a team have to work a little bit extra for their possession. Michigan, wonderful week for the Wolverines, a team that when we had Charlie Cream on, they had lost to Wisconsin, but then pounded Oregon. But we were like, what is this team? Are they starting to hit that freshman wall where maybe they don't have it anymore? They obviously pound Oregon. They then go to Nebraska and pound the Cornhuskers. Like, this game was not really ever close.
Hmm.
They they tried to make a comeback, but they outscored Nebraska 24-7 in the second quarter. I think they scored like the first 13, 15, something like that points in the quarter. And they led by 21 at halftime and just ran away with this one in Lincoln. That's back-to-back home losses this week for Nebraska, who we'll talk about in a minute and the concerns that might be having in Lincoln. But this was impressive stuff from Michigan. And then unfortunately, you got the front row seat of their momentum continuing
Yeah.
into East Lansing. These are two places. It's not like they went into two places that are typically not that hard to win at. They went to Lincoln and East Lansing and took both games by double figures. A really, really impressive week by Michigan. Every time we have started to doubt this trio of freshmen and Kim Barnes-Arico and this 2025 version of Michigan, they seem to come back with some sort of statement win, or this week wins, that allows them right back into the conversation. That's 3 wins in a row now over NCAA tournament teams, 2 of them on the road, all 3 by double figures. Michigan is firmly in the tournament. There is no doubt about that at this point for a team that Charlie Cream didn't even want to consider in August. He was like, there's too much new. They lost too much. And here we are sitting in mid-February. I'm declaring it. They're in the tournament. There's no issues there. They could work themselves up to a 6 seed, maybe get themselves out of the 1 and 2 pod. And this is a team that's dangerous when March rolls around.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And what's interesting to me too, Austin, and I would have been with Charlie before the season. I mean, I don't know how you bank on
Yeah,
a starting lineup of
for
3
sure.
freshmen to just expect success, but here they are. And for the first 2 to 2.5 months, the conversation we had about Michigan time and time again was, wow, against these really good teams, they are close
Yeah.
and they're winning all the games they should. And we kind of were sitting there waiting and waiting, and then they go on the road at Minnesota. Minnesota was ranked at the time, and they picked up their first top 25 win. And that was a month ago, just about a month ago, a
Yeah.
little under, about 3 weeks or so. And then we said, okay, there's a ranked win. And then Michigan State rolled into town and they lost by 30 on their home floor. And that's what really kind of said, we're kind of confused at this point. But to your point, you laid out what the last week and a half has been, where they blow out Oregon by 32. They beat Nebraska on their floor by 18, and then they beat Michigan State. At Michigan State, a crowd of 11,043 people were in East Lansing for that game. A hostile environment and a rivalry game for a freshman-led team to step up and persevere through. It was impressive. And you're right. I mean, Michigan, we can now kind of figure out who they are because much like Iowa, they're catching fire and clicking now. Like they are on a roll now. They're trending upwards now. Um, I think one of the interesting things too, and we could have this conversation about Michigan State later, because I mean you brought out the Nebraska result, and I think that's one of the biggest interesting sub stories to this is we got to talk about Nebraska, because Nebraska is really becoming concerning. But for Michigan State, much like I was talking about Ohio State, I think there's a bit of this with Michigan State where the Spartans, I don't think they fully have hit their potential either. We've seen it in glimpses when they went and handled Illinois at Illinois. That was a wonderful performance. That second half at Michigan, you saw what this team can be, but having a hard time putting that all together. And much like we talk about Ohio State, look, if you want to beat UCLA, you force 23 turnovers, you got to hit some shots. They didn't. They shot 29%. Michigan State in this game shot 31% from the floor, and they went 12 of 29 on layups. I just, it, at some point you're going to have to figure that out to beat this caliber of team. And for Michigan State, they unfortunately couldn't do it in a game that the Spartans really wanted to.
Yeah, you're not going to win a lot of games shooting 31% from the floor, and there's almost a fearlessness to this Michigan team.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like a Padraig Harrington quote from golf, where he said, and I don't know the direct quote, but it was about like innocence is bliss. Like sometimes these young players in golf can go win a major championship right away because they have no scar tissue whatsoever. These young players from Michigan have no scar tissue of losing in the Breslin Center. They have no
Mhm.
scar tissue. They're no fear. They went to LA or Las Vegas and almost beat South Carolina on national TV on the opening day of the season. There's no fear. And there's something about that for this Michigan team. And there's also something about another golf analogy. You put yourself in contention enough times, you're probably going to learn from your fault, your
Yep.
shortcomings, and figure out what you have to do in the final 4 or 5 holes to win the tournament. And we actually just saw that this week with Thomas Dietrich at the Phoenix Open. He'd been close a ton of times. He finally figures out how to win. Well, Michigan, for the longest time, they're in all these close games with these really good teams, and they're not getting it across the finish line. And then they go to Minnesota. Their last 6 games are kind of wild. I believe these are their last 6. At Minnesota, they win, a ranked win on the road. They come home and get thumped by Michigan State by 30. They then lose at Wisconsin, one of the head scratchers of the season.
Yeah.
And then they come home and beat Oregon by 32. They go to Nebraska to win by 18. And then they go to Michigan State and win by 10. My goodness, we're going to start puking from this roller coaster that Michigan's on right now. My Hoosiers are hoping that the roller coaster continues this week, but they're playing some really good basketball, and I think it deserves to be shouted out. Big week for them. They're at home against Indiana, and then on the road at Maryland Monday. An opportunity for this young team to continue to move their way up the list. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, just to tie the bow on Michigan before we move on, for some of the people who may not have watched them a ton this year, they play a 5-guard lineup just about the entirety of the ball game. So it's 5 guards,
Yep.
5 out basketball. And so I had questions personally when they hosted Oregon. How do you handle 6'8" Philly Che if you're Michigan and you don't have a lot of size? But they have found ways to maneuver that and beat that with a 5-guard lineup. And to your point about the fearlessness, we've also seen the maturation a bit, because that 30-point loss they had at home to Michigan State, they were rattled that second half. You could see the overwhelming tide change when Michigan State started to pressure them. There were moments of pressure and being rattled in this game against Michigan State, but for the most part, they were composed. And in that first game where they lost by 30 to MSU, Silas Swords had just 4 points. This last time she had 19. It's a huge dramatic difference between those two meetings. I just wanted to throw that in.
Yeah, I forgot to put the graphic up that she was my freshman of the week with that performance
Agreed.
in the Breslin Center. Um, you want to talk Nebraska now? I
Let's do
don't. Let's do it, because I think a conversation needs to be had at this point with the Cornhuskers. They have now lost a bunch of games here in a row. You think about, they lose to Indiana on the road. I believe that was a 16-point loss. And then they lose back-to-back home games by 18 and 15. So that's 3 straight losses by at least 15 points.
The way your tone changed, it makes it sound like this is an intervention for the
Well,
Huskers.
it might be an intervention. It's I don't I'm concerned. I'm
Yeah.
worried. Like I would sit down with Nebraska. If Nebraska was an inanimate object, and I would sit down and I would say, I'm very worried about you. Like I just I the Natalie Potts thing has weighed over this team all season, and I get that. But they're not the only team that has lost somebody important to injury. Think about what it, and again, maybe this shines more light on the good that Shauna Green has done with Illinois,
Sure.
managing the loss of Makaira Cook and Gretchen Dolan. Maryland started to look a little bit more this weekend like they're figuring it out as they've dealt with the Bree McDaniel and the Cheyenne Sellers injuries. Minnesota has played almost the whole season without Mara Braun, and they seem to be figuring it out as they go. Now, there's bumps and bruises, certainly, but for Nebraska, I still feel like they don't know who they are. And
Mhm.
there's a bit of an identity crisis going on with Nebraska right now. And I mentioned it last pod. Their defense in the Big Ten has not been good. Before the Indiana game, they were averaging 72 points a game given up. They gave up 76 to Indiana, 78 to Michigan, and now 81 to Iowa. So that's probably closer to 75 points a game now in
Mhm.
conference play. That's concerning. And part of that is when you don't have a consistent offense, your defense, you know this, Dalton, and most basketball fans do. It's a cohesive unit. So when you're struggling to score, you're going to struggle to defend for long periods of time because you're just getting worn out because you can't get anything going offensively, and vice versa. You can't get any stops on the defensive side of the floor. It's hard to score on the offensive side. Nebraska's just in an interesting spot right now. I'll pull up their schedule here because they were a 10 seed or thereabouts in bracketology. Actually, I think Charlie put out a new one today. So let's see if he did. Yep, he did. He put a new bracketology out. Yes, this morning, and
I haven't seen this yet.
Nebraska finds themselves as the second to last team in the field.
Okay.
So they are much closer to the cut line than they would A, like to be, and B, probably were 2 weeks ago.
It's time to sound the alarm at that point.
I think so. Washington, for those wondering, Washington is still the first team out. Indiana, Oregon, Minnesota still in the last four receiving buys. Iowa yanked out of there. They're safely in the field at the moment. What do we make of Nebraska? What do we make of where this team is at? I mentioned I was pulling up their schedule and then I forgot to do so. They will finish the season with back-to-back road games coming up here at Maryland and at Illinois, followed by Oregon and Washington coming to town and finishing at Northwestern.
Uh,
There's no
I
bye games there.
no.
And all of a sudden, you've lost three straight all by 15 or more, and now you got to go to Maryland and you got to go to Illinois in your next two games. Not playing great basketball right now. I agree with you. It might be time to sound the alarms in Lincoln.
And Oregon Washington is not an easy
Yep.
swing either that we talk about. And honestly, even if you look at that last one, Northwestern, even though the wins
On
don't
the road.
necessarily follow it, Northwestern's been playing some solid
And
basketball.
they
The
could
wins
be
are some
desperate trying to get an extra win to get into the Big Ten tournament.
absolutely. And the battle of Kaylee Walsh and Markowski, it's going to be interesting to see because those Northwestern forwards are a bit more versatile. I think that's going to be an interesting matchup when that time comes. But overall about Nebraska, I think you nailed it on the head. I think we were willing to and should justifiably give them a grace period after Natalie Potts to try and figure things out. But it feels like that window is shut. And the question is, the reality of the rest of the season. Granted, you have that big injury. She's not coming back.
No.
And at a certain point, it's been weeks and weeks and weeks, and we're still not really sure if Nebraska can move on without Natalie Potts to an extent of being a caliber team for the NCAA tournament. I
Yep.
mean, they've still gotten some wins. It's not like they're all of a sudden at the bottom five of the Big Ten. But if we're talking about the expectation being an NCAA tournament team, I don't know if Nebraska without Potts has been able to provide an answer in the last month and a half. And we're at a point now where it's the reality conversation instead of the grace conversation of giving them time to figure it out. It's okay. She's not coming back. Can you be an NCAA tournament team in these
Yeah.
final 3 weeks?
Well, and I thought it was interesting when we asked Charlie Cream, what do you do with injuries? It's, do you have enough sample size of the team without that certain player? And in
Yep.
Nebraska's case, yes, you
We've now
absolutely
hit there.
do.
Yes.
And she's not coming back. So this is the team that will be evaluated by the committee. They have beaten 2 NCAA tournament teams since the new year, Michigan State and at Iowa, which are both great wins and are both doing a
Sure.
lot of heavy lifting. But they've lost 4 of their last 5. And now, like we said, the road only gets tougher. So we'll check back in next week on our friends in Lincoln, and we'll see how they're doing, because this could be a week where they totally change the narrative, or by next Tuesday's bracketology, they could be on the outside looking in.
Yep.
I think if you're thinking to yourself as a Nebraska fan, is there a number we need to get to? They're 16-8 right now, 7-5 in the Big Ten. Is that right? Or are they 7-6 now? I think they're 7-6. Yes, they are. So I would say they probably need to be over 500 in those 5 games remaining.
Mm-hmm.
If you can go 3-2 in Maryland, Illinois, Oregon, Washington, Northwestern, that essentially means you probably win at Northwestern, because that would be the most damaging loss of
Right.
those 5. You need to win that one. And maybe you win your 2 home games. Maybe you grab one of those road games. I mean, 4-1 would be great. I think if you finish 4-1, you're a tournament team. You're good.
Yep.
But 3-2 is probably enough. Again, it's a weak bubble. It's not like people are pushing to get in. Washington might have something to say. You think about that game in Lincoln. 2 teams, one on this side of the bubble, one on this side of the bubble. That's gonna be an intense game in Lincoln.
I was gonna say that's actually a great point. Like that it could come down to where both of those teams are playing for their ticket to the dance in that matchup. But I mean, you mentioned 3-2, and I think you're right. If Nebraska goes 3-2, they feel a little bit better about their postseason with the NCAA tournament. The 3-2 is also a difficult ask,
Yes.
especially given how they've been trajecting or trending downwards. And to your point earlier, where you were talking about the cohesive style of basketball at MSU, head coach Robin Fraley calls it connected basketball all the time. We've got to be connected. Our press has to be effective and with a purpose, and it has to then turn into offense with a purpose and effective. And those two feed off of each other to make the Michigan State style of game. With Nebraska, the last few games you watched, that half court offense is frustrated.
Mm-hmm.
You can almost feel the frustration coming off of Markowski in the post at times. It's just a frustrating half court offense for the Huskers, but they've got opportunities, as you said. 5 games go in this regular season. You win 3 of them. I think you're in a good spot.
If you go, let's say they go 2-3. I mean, now you're looking at a record of 18-11, 9-9, the Big Ten. That's gonna be tough, but we'll
You have to
see.
win games in that tournament.
Yes, yeah, the Big Ten tournament still stands as an opportunity for everybody. Rapid fire. We haven't even talked about Maryland much with their West Coast
Oh yeah.
swing. Kayleen Schmeichel was sensational. 36 in the win at Washington. I tell you what, Washington at the back end of some of those East teams coming west is taking some beatings. You think about Iowa, Lucy Olson not missing a shot, and the Hawkeyes shooting 71%. Then Indiana comes in and Gearzone puts up 35. And now Maryland comes in and Schmeichel puts up 36. They've had some beatings there on the wrong side of that road trip. But Maryland gets 2 wins, dominating over Oregon, 79-61. Again, that's the thing with Oregon. If you can score, which is easier said than done against their defense, but they're going to have a tough time hanging with you if you
Mm-hmm.
score more than 65 points.
Exactly.
So now we saw Maryland get off to a red hot start in this game, and Oregon doesn't necessarily have the firepower. If they can hang within 6, 8, maybe even 10 points of you in a low scoring game, they're in it. But
Yep.
if, like what Maryland did, they just jumped on them early and often. And when you could do that, I mean, it's 19-9 after the first quarter. It's 39-22 at halftime. Ball game.
Yep.
I just don't think Oregon has that gear to get back into it. Then they go to Washington, win 81-73. Very nice win. Again, they jumped out early, but then Washington kind of responded. And I should say they didn't jump out early. They were trailing at the end of the first quarter, but that second quarter was 25-9. They take the halftime lead. They hang on in the fourth quarter. So now, Maryland, where do we view them? I mean, I'll go ahead and make this a transition into our power rankings. Where do we view Maryland right now as they come out of that Pacific Northwest trip 2-0 and maybe back into more of where we saw them at before the slippage there?
Well, and it's funny you got the power rankings up visually, and for the listeners just on audio, Austin and I both agree 1 through 3, UCLA, USC, Ohio State. 4, 5, 6, we have a different order of Maryland, Michigan State, and Illinois. That's my order. Austin has Illinois, Maryland, Michigan State. But honestly, that's kind of where I see Maryland for the moment. And I think they've got potential where, I mean, we said before that they seem to clearly be one of those top 4 teams. After the McDaniel and Sellers brief injury, things got a little bit dicier for the Terps, and they kind of struggled to refine their footing. But it feels like this last week, maybe they got back on the treadmill. Maybe they've gotten back into that rhythm. But I feel like at this point, Austin, the way we have 4 through 6, where it's just some combination of Maryland, Michigan State, Illinois, that feels like the right tier. That feels fair.
Yeah, the Maryland's final schedule is very friendly here, I would say. If a schedule can be friendly in the Big Ten, you've got Nebraska and Michigan at home this week, at Northwestern, at Indiana, home to Ohio State. So 3 of your last 5 at home, 4 of your last 5 against unranked opponents. So an opportunity for Maryland to grab a hold of that top 4 spot in the Big Ten. I have them above Michigan State. So do you. I kept Illinois up there because it's not necessarily anti-Michigan State. It's just that Michigan State lost the game at home, and Illinois has continued to just go about its business. And so I want to reward Illinois. Again, I still have my questions about how sustainable this is against good teams moving forward. They weren't really tested this week. I think it was Penn State and Wisconsin that they played this week. So we'll see. But they go to LA in a couple weeks. Not expecting them to win those games, but I am curious how they will play in those games. But as for now, I have Illinois at 4, ahead of Maryland because of the head-to-head. I think that matters, especially since they went on the road and beat Maryland. And then Michigan State at 6. I do think there's a bit of a gap from 6 to 7. Your 7 is Michigan. Mine is Iowa. We flip them. My 8 is Michigan. Your 8 is Iowa. And then we both have Indiana sitting at number 9.
Yep.
We haven't talked about the Hoosiers yet. Minute 53. They beat Rutgers. Had one of the best quarters that I've ever seen shooting the basketball. But then they lose. They lose at Minnesota. So I'm sitting there doing some prep yesterday. And I went and looked, and Charlie Cream came on here and said, look, they just seem really good when they make shots. And that's what we've always said. So I went and looked. When they make 9 3-pointers in a game this season, they are 11-0. When they make less than 9, they are 4-8. So there is, like, when you watch them, you go, oh, yeah, they're a really good team when the shots fall. Well, the stats and the numbers back that up. They are really good when the shots fall. When the shots don't fall, like against Minnesota, what do? What can you depend on? And that's the $1 million question right now for Indiana, is when the shots aren't falling, what do you do? And unfortunately, Sophie Hart kind of dominated the post in this game against Minnesota. Hoosiers were out-rebounded. This has been a big issue as well. Hoosiers were out-rebounded 43-25. They have now been out-rebounded or tied on the glass in 11 straight games. They have not out-rebounded an opponent since December 22nd against Oakland. They've only done it once in the Big Ten. That was the early December game against Penn State. So something to keep an eye on. They're last in the Big Ten in rebounds per game. They're averaging less than 30 rebounds a game in conference games. So, and Coach Morin always tells me rebounding is about effort, fight, will. There's not really like a technique or strategy to really change up. It's got to be about your desire to go get the basketball. So at some point, Indiana's going to have to show that. The glaring one, Dalton, was Lily Meister and Caroline Strickland combined for 1 rebound in the
Ooh,
Minnesota game. Caroline
I didn't catch
Strickland was pretty good offensively, but had 0 rebounds.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of stuff you just can't have. And the guards have to be more involved on the glass. I don't know what it is, but if you let Indiana get 3-point shots off, they're probably going to make a big majority of them, and they're probably going to win the game. But if you run Indiana off the 3-point line, you contest their looks, you don't let them get a lot from beyond the arc, Indiana's gettable. And so they're a
Yep.
hard team to figure out what to do in these rankings. I still feel like they're an NCAA tournament team. They're going to win a couple more games here down the stretch, certainly, and get themselves into the tournament. They just are kind of a high volatility type of team. Like, they get hot, they could beat somebody. Maryland and
Mhm.
Ohio State both come to Bloomington. Could Indiana get hot on its home floor and beat them? Certainly. But Indiana is also capable of struggling from beyond the arc and therefore struggling to score. And that was on display in Minneapolis. That's my Indiana segment of the show. Minnesota deserves credit. They played very well in that game. Amaya Battle scored her 1,000th career point. Mallory Heyer back-to-back double-doubles. She's one of those just do the dirty work players.
Yes.
And I came away so impressed with what Dawn Plitzowite has done with Minnesota that I don't think there's any arguing that's not the most talented team on paper,
Especially without Braun.
especially without Mara Braun. Exactly. But what she's done to make that team an 18-win team, I think they're up to 19 now, and they're over 500 of the Big Ten. They've improved substantially even from last year and obviously from the year before that. And they're a tournament team more than likely. So good for Dawn Plitzowite in Minnesota. And the crowd was great. I remember going to Minnesota a couple of years ago, and the place was empty. So they're getting a lot of attention. They're getting a lot of people to really support this team. So good for what's going on there in Minneapolis. Anyway, that's a long-winded way of putting our power rankings on the screen for those of you watching. I would say Minnesota and Oregon are the 2 knocking on the door for me. They're at 10 and 11. Would you agree with that?
I would have Minnesota 10, Oregon 11.
Yep.
And then I'd probably go Nebraska 12, Washington 13 for the time being.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to see them play here pretty soon. But yeah, it's nitpicking at that point there between those 2. But
if one of those wants to jump up and grab the win, they can leapfrog. Like,
I keep waiting on somebody, Dalton, in this middle pack to like go and get it. And maybe Iowa and Michigan are in the process of doing that.
Yeah.
But you're just waiting on somebody to separate. Again, this is the Big Ten standings. Illinois would have the tiebreaker head-to-head with Maryland at 9-4. Oregon has the tiebreaker over Nebraska, Iowa, and Minnesota because when you have a multi-team tie, it goes to your head-to-head records against everyone in your tie.
Mm-hmm.
Oregon's 1-0. They haven't played Nebraska. They haven't played Minnesota yet, but they beat Iowa. Nebraska's 2-1, a win over Iowa and a win over Minnesota. So they would jump up to the 10. Iowa's 2-2. They've beaten Minnesota and Nebraska, but lost to Nebraska and Oregon. And Minnesota hasn't won against any of those teams, so they are the 12th seed. But again, that's how close it is. The 12th seed is losing a 4-way tiebreaker from being the 9 seed and getting the bye. So there's a lot on the line here coming down the stretch. And for all these inconsistent teams, Dalton, one less game in the Big Ten tournament means a lot.
Absolutely. Well, and it sets up for so much drama with that middle pack. We've been talking about the top. We've been talking about the middle. But Well, while we got the standings up there, that bottom is going to be interesting here in these
Yes.
final 2 weeks too, because Rutgers, with Wisconsin beating Michigan, it gave them their second win. Rutgers beats Purdue this weekend to get their second win, and now those two are sitting at 14 and 15. They would be in the field, and the
Yep.
three that would not be in the Big Ten tournament as of now is Northwestern, Purdue, Penn State. But there's some games amongst each other, and
Yes. This
so
week.
whether you want to emphasize the top of the Big Ten, the middle of the Big Ten, or the bottom of the Big Ten, there's going to be a lot of drama in these final 3 weeks.
Northwestern got its first win over Penn State this week, 69
Yep.
to 63. Rutgers beat Purdue 78-69. The big question right now is we haven't heard anything from the Big Ten on what's happening with Northwestern's LA games.
Yep.
I don't know. I would like to hear something at some point as to what's going to happen. We're down to 3 weeks left in the season. Like, it's clearly not going to get made up. So unless you're going to have them square off at Westfield High School when they get to Indianapolis for the Big Ten tournament,
You know what? I'm in for that. I would
that would
go
be
to that game.
hilarious. Put them at Carmel High School. Let's let them battle it out and see who wins. But anyway, I'm a little surprised we haven't heard anything on that. But
Yeah.
I don't know if they don't get made up, if that means they won't play. Does Northwestern have to forfeit? So in my mind, I kind of look at Northwestern as 1-12, not 1-10. I don't know if that's fair or not, but we'll see. We're talking about things that are out of our control, certainly.
Right.
But if we were to play the hypothetical and we were to turn this into a bracket, the first day of the tournament would feature Nebraska against Rutgers, Iowa against Wisconsin, Minnesota against Washington, which would be fascinating.
Absolutely.
Indiana takes on Oregon in a rematch of just an ugly basketball game in Eugene. And then Maryland, I believe, would get the winner of the 15-10. Is that how that would work? No, they would get the winner of 12-13 probably.
Correct.
Yeah,
Yes.
so Maryland would get the winner of Minnesota, Washington. Michigan State would get the winner of Iowa, Wisconsin, and Michigan would get the winner of Nebraska, Rutgers. So you're looking at potential matchups just of tournament teams if we're projecting ahead. Minnesota, Washington, that's a huge bubble matchup. Indiana, Oregon, two teams in the last 4 byes. Michigan could potentially end up playing Nebraska. Michigan State could potentially get a rematch of an early
With
season
Iowa.
Big Ten game with Iowa. And then Maryland could get a matchup with Minnesota or Washington. So awesome to think about what could happen in the Big Ten tournament. We're over an hour, so we should probably talk about what's coming up in this next week, because I think it's the game of the week, Dalton, or the game of the year. Maybe UCLA is at USC this week. I was going to do this before the show and I forgot, so I'm going to pull up and I'll just kind of talk through it. Her Hoop Stats does a really good comparison tool of teams, and I'm just curious how these two teams, if you were to put their 2 paper resumes up, I mean, you're looking at both of them are top 15 in the country in scoring. They're top 30 in opponent points per game. They both shoot the ball well, but I would say that UCLA shoots it better. Neither team is all that great from the 3-point line. UCLA does not get to the free throw line as much as UCLA does. Both teams are outstanding defensively. They're both top 6 in the country in opponent field goal percentage. Both are wonderful rebounding teams, 4th and 7th in the country in rebounding. UCLA leads the country in total rebound rate. So you're nitpicking if you're trying to find differences between these two teams, Dalton. From what you've seen, what are you excited to watch, and what could maybe be the difference in this game?
I mean, that feels, honestly, the initial reaction just is this is the heavyweight fight we've been wanting to see since we started the year. I mean, we wanted to see this matchup, and it feels kind of bizarre that it's actually here now.
I know.
It's just been forever down the road, and now
eventually we'll see them play.
Yeah, right. But Juju Watkins, Lauren Betts, all this, it's so exciting. I think the big thing to watch for is like we've talked about, and I think this is even similar with this talent of a team as USC that exists. If you're going to beat UCLA, You've got to take advantage of opportunities. UCLA does not make a ton of mistakes, and the model is so simply put, I suppose, where you throw it into Lauren Betts. If you want to go one-on-one with her, good luck. She'll try to eat you up in the post. You want to send some extra help? There's shooters around. They don't make many mistakes. It's such a simplistic and effective style that they play. So if you're USC, we've seen at times where they couldn't take advantage, or we saw them get down 20-1 against Iowa in that game. We've seen some of those instances. USC has got to come up. We got to see Juju at her best. We got to see that team at their best. And even if UCLA is playing at its best, USC at its best gives us a close one down the stretch.
The matchups that are going to be so intriguing: Kiki Rice on Juju
Yeah,
Watkins, and then Kiki Iriafen against Lauren
that's
Betts. Can Iriafen go one-on-one?
yep.
Because if you have somebody who can go one-on-one with her, that's going to help out greatly. Philly Che was able to go a little bit one-on-one with Lauren Betts in that game in Oregon. They held her to 9 points. So can you go one-on-one with her, and that allows you to stay with the shooters?
And real quick, Austin, I've likened it before to Purdue men's basketball, the way UCLA
Yep.
plays, right? How they used to do it with Zach Edey in the previous 2 years. You remember that national championship game? They didn't have to double Zach Edey. Donovan
Yep.
Clingan was able to handle one-on-one. Now, I say handle. Edey still ate him up a decent amount, but it shut down the water of the perimeter attack. And with
Well, and
shutting that off, that's
that's
enough.
that's the battle of, like, do you let Lauren Betts get her 20 to 22, but make sure the 3-point shots aren't falling? That's going to be fascinating.
But to your point, you have Iriafen, who's a worthy defender and
Yep.
matchup for
Yep.
bets, and it's something different that a lot of teams on the Big Ten men's side the last 2 years didn't have somebody who could
Nope.
match up with a Zach Edey, and so when Klingon comes around, they battle, but nothing else was there. And maybe that's the trick for USC. They don't have to double because Iriafen is there, a worthy defender in a matchup against bets. Maybe it shuts off the perimeter attack, and the twos just don't add up to be enough.
And you hate to say it, but the way the game is officiated could also play a large
Yeah.
role into this game. I mean, who stays on the floor? Does Betts get in foul trouble? Does Erie Fenn get in foul trouble? We shall see. Other games coming up this week. Wednesday night, two big bubble matchups. Indiana is at Michigan, a game the Hoosiers. I said the stretch from Nebraska to Purdue, which is this weekend. 5 games. I wanted to see Indiana go 4-1. They're 2-1 right now. You feel good about playing Purdue on your home floor. Can you get this win at Michigan? This feels like a really big one for Indiana to kind of keep the momentum going. I know it sputtered in Minneapolis, but if you come back and you get this win, you still feel like you look up at the standings and you're 8-5. And let's say you beat Purdue, and then you look at the standings and you're 9-5. And you're
Mhm.
right there in the thick of it for maybe that 4 seed with Ohio State, Maryland, and Michigan State still on the schedule. So this is a big one for Indiana. And then a huge one, I think, for Washington. An opportunity for them to get a road win, a quad one victory if they can get it on the road at Oregon late night on Wednesday. Thursday, Nebraska at Maryland. Interesting one there with what's going on with Nebraska. Minnesota gets tested on the road at Ohio State. And then, of course, the gigantic one that night on Thursday, UCLA at USC.
My God.
Sunday, good trio of games. Oregon at Minnesota, Nebraska at Illinois, and Michigan State start to tell a swing at UCLA. And then Monday, good couple of games on Monday, President's Day. So we get a noon one, Iowa at Ohio State, and then 6 o'clock Monday, Michigan at Maryland. Anything stand out to you there? I know we circled the one Thursday night, but what else stands out?
Well, besides the fact that Monday is President's Day, I was not aware. And so I'll be at LA for a 9 a.m. tip of Iowa at
Woo!
Ohio State. I could wake up some Big Ten women's basketball. That's exciting for me personally. But no, outside of that, I think Michigan's one of those teams that's really interesting to watch since we talked about the streak they're on, hosting Indiana in this one, and then at Maryland. I think it's a big week for the Wolverines. Now, to your point, you've already locked them into the field, so I don't necessarily know that they have a ton to prove.
I have.
But nonetheless, those are big games and big opportunities. And in Nebraska, at Maryland, at Illinois, we talked about it earlier. You finished the swing, though, on the wrong side of that, and it's an uphill battle the rest of the way for the Huskers. So I think those are pretty big.
They could be looking at a 7-8 record, losers of 5 in a row if Nebraska doesn't right the ship on the road this week. And on the Michigan front, look, I'm locking them in the field, assuming they're going to continue to keep playing the way they are. If they go
Right. No, I got you.
0-5 the rest of the way, or 0-6, however many they have left, then yeah, I'm not going to lock them in the field at that point. But I'm assuming they're going to get a couple of wins here coming down the stretch. Great week. To recap, and a great week to look forward to, Dalton. Always great chatting Big Ten basketball with you. A reminder, if you enjoy our show, tell a friend, tell a few friends. Let us know. We appreciate the help in growing the podcast. And the next time we talk, we're going to have to figure out the schedule because Dalton's going to be in L.A.
That's right.
We'll figure it out. Maybe it'll be me and somebody else. Maybe it'll be me and Dalton. Maybe who knows what we're going to do. But keep an eye on the Dribble Drive social account on X. It's Dribble Drive WBB. We'll tweet out any schedule changes we may have to make with Dalton exploring the Los Angeles area next Tuesday. But thanks for joining us, Dalton. Always great chatting some basketball with you.
So exciting. It's been a lot of fun, Austin.
Well, reminder, check out all our episodes live at noon on Tuesdays, and then they're available afterward on the Backbone Network YouTube channel or in podcast form on Apple and Spotify. Enjoy the Big Ten basketball this weekend. We'll talk to you guys next time. For Dalton Shetler, I'm Austin Render. This has been episode 38 of the Dribble Drive.